The morning sun streamed through the airport's glass windows as passengers lined up to board Elite Airways Flight 207 from New York to Los Angeles. The first-class cabin gleamed with its plush leather seats and polished surfaces, ready to welcome its premium travelers. Flight attendant Jennifer Chen moved efficiently through her pre-flight routine, straightening magazines and ensuring each seat had its complement of amenities. Jennifer had worked this route for 12 years, and she took special pride in maintaining what she considered the proper atmosphere in first class. Her supervisor had often praised her attention to detail, though some colleagues quietly mentioned she could be a bit too rigid with the rules. Today, she felt particularly determined to keep everything running smoothly because several corporate executives were expected on board. As the first-class boarding began, Jennifer watched the usual parade of business suits and designer luggage. She greeted each passenger with a practiced smile, directing them to their seats with professional efficiency. The familiar rhythm of boarding was interrupted when she spotted an elderly black woman approaching the first-class cabin. The woman wore simple clothing, a modest brown sweater, comfortable slacks, and well-worn but clean walking shoes. She carried an old leather handbag and moved unhurriedly, like someone who had all the time in the world. Something about her presence made several passengers turn their heads, though Jennifer mistook their interest for concern. Without hesitation, Jennifer stepped into the aisle, effectively blocking the woman's path. Her voice carried the artificial sweetness that barely masked her condescension. "Excuse me, ma'am, but economy class boarding hasn't started yet. You'll need to wait another 30 minutes. She gestured toward the terminal, expecting immediate compliance. The elderly woman paused, her gentle eyes taking in Jennifer's stance and expression. There was something in those eyes, a depth of experience that hinted at countless similar encounters over the years. Instead of showing anger or frustration, she simply reached into her handbag with deliberate slowness. "Young lady," she said in a voice that carried the warm tones of someone used to being heard without raising their voice. "I believe you might want to check my boarding pass before making assumptions." She held out the document, but didn't immediately hand it over, requiring Jennifer to step forward and take it. The other passengers in line had grown quiet, watching the scene unfold. A young tech entrepreneur lowered his phone from his ear, his attention caught by the interaction. A mother whispered something to her teenage daughter, who frowned at Jennifer's behavior. Jennifer took the boarding pass with visible skepticism, her perfectly manicured nails gripping the paper as if it might be counterfeit. Her eyes widened slightly as she read the seat assignment, 1A, the prime spot in first class. Rather than apologize for her mistake, she doubled down. "I'll need to see some identification as well. We've had issues with stolen credentials recently." The elderly woman's expression didn't change, but something flickered in her eyes, not anger, but something more like mild amusement mixed with weary recognition. She reached once more into her handbag, movements unhurried despite the growing line behind her. Several more passengers had stopped to watch, and one businessman in line had discreetly taken out his phone, sensing that something significant was about to unfold. The atmosphere in the jet bridge had transformed from the usual boarding routine into something charged with tension. Jennifer stood her ground, despite the murmurs of disapproval from other passengers. She had convinced herself she was doing her job, protecting the airline's premium cabin from someone who clearly didn't belong there, at least according to her preconceptions. Little did she know that this moment would not only change the course of her career, but would also become a turning point for the entire airline's approach to customer service and human dignity. The elderly woman finally pulled out her identification, holding it with the quiet confidence of someone who had nothing to prove, yet was about to prove everything. Dr. Rose Washington stood quietly in the jet bridge, feeling the familiar ache in her knees from a long day of meetings. At 68, she had learned to pace herself, but today had been particularly demanding. She'd spent the morning touring one of her airline's maintenance facilities in disguise, watching how the staff operated when they didn't know the boss was around. It was something she'd done regularly throughout her 40-year career, showing up unannounced, dressed in simple clothes, observing the true character of her employees. Her choice of outfit today, the comfortable brown sweater and worn slacks, was intentional. She'd left her designer suits and expensive jewelry in her hotel room. Experience had taught her that people revealed their true nature when they thought they were dealing with someone ordinary, someone they could dismiss without consequences. The young flight attendant's reaction, while disappointing, wasn't surprising. Rose had faced similar treatment countless times, long before she owned an airline. Each encounter brought back memories. The bank managers who dismissed her business plans in the 1980s, the investors who talked down to her, the competitors who'd underestimated her. She'd proven them all wrong, building Elite Airways from a single regional plane into an international carrier. As she stood there, watching the flight attendant scrutinize her ID with exaggerated suspicion, Rose felt the eyes of other passengers on her. A businessman in an expensive suit had stopped typing on his phone to watch. Two college students whispered to each other, their expressions showing they recognized the unfairness of the situation. A grandmother holding her young granddaughter's hand gave Rose a subtle nod of support. The flight attendant's voice cut through her thoughts. "Ma'am, I'll need to verify this ID with my supervisor. These credentials seem unusual." The artificial politeness had evolved into barely concealed suspicion. Rose adjusted her reading glasses and spoke in the same gentle tone she'd used with her own children and grandchildren. "Of course, dear. Though I should mention that I designed that ID badge system myself last year. The holographic security feature can be a bit tricky to spot if you're not familiar with it." She pointed to a subtle shimmer in the card's corner, her finger steady despite her fatigue. A young software developer in line behind her couldn't suppress a slight chuckle. He'd noticed the elite status markers on the ID that the flight attendant was completely missing. The flight attendant's cheeks flushed red, but she maintained her defensive posture. Rose could have ended the confrontation immediately by announcing who she was. She could have pulled out her phone and called any executive in the company. Instead, she chose to wait, to let this moment become a learning experience. Her decades in business had taught her that real change doesn't come from flexing power. It comes from helping people recognize their own biases. She thought about her granddaughter, who was about the same age as this flight attendant. How many times would she face similar prejudices in her life? These moments weren't just about personal dignity. They were opportunities to create lasting change. "Take your time," Rose said softly, watching the flight attendant's internal struggle play across her face. "I know you're just trying to do your job, but sometimes we need to ask ourselves why we make certain assumptions about people." The other passengers had grown completely silent, sensing they were witnessing something significant. A few had their phones out now, recording discreetly. Rose noticed but didn't mind. Sometimes these uncomfortable moments needed to be documented, not for revenge or public shaming, but to show others how to handle discrimination with grace and wisdom. She shifted her weight slightly, easing the pressure on her tired feet. The flight attendant was now speaking quietly into her handheld radio, presumably calling for backup. Rose smiled inwardly, knowing what would happen next. The captain would emerge from the cockpit any moment now, and this young woman's understanding of the world would shift dramatically. But Rose wasn't interested in humiliation or revenge. She was already thinking about how to turn this incident into a teaching moment for her entire company. The tension in the jet bridge had reached a breaking point. Jennifer Chen, the flight attendant, held Dr. Washington's ID and boarding pass in trembling hands, her perfectly maintained professional facade beginning to crack. The growing crowd of first-class passengers watched the scene unfold, their own boarding momentarily forgotten. "These credentials," Jennifer announced, her voice pitched slightly higher than normal, "seem irregular. We've had issues with fraudulent tickets recently." She tapped her finger against the boarding pass, drawing attention to imaginary inconsistencies. A few passengers exchanged knowing looks. They'd seen this kind of treatment before, though rarely so blatant. A young tech entrepreneur in a hoodie spoke up from the line. "Ma'am, I don't mean to interrupt, but I recognize that platinum card she's holding. It's the invitation-only level. There are only about 50 of those in circulation." His voice carried the authority of someone who knew exactly what he was talking about. Jennifer's eyes flickered to the card again, uncertainty creeping into her expression. Dr. Washington remained steady, her calm presence a stark contrast to the flight attendant's growing agitation. She'd spent decades in boardrooms, facing down hostile takeover attempts and skeptical investors. This moment, while unfortunate, was far from the most challenging situation she'd handled. Her voice, when she spoke, carried the weight of experience without a hint of anger. "Young lady," she said, reaching into her worn leather bag once more. "Perhaps this might help clear things up." She pulled out her Elite Airways corporate ID, the one she rarely used. Even then, she didn't immediately show it, giving Jennifer one last chance to step back from the precipice of her assumptions. The businessman who had been recording the interaction on his phone stepped closer, his own first-class ticket visible in his breast pocket. "This is completely unacceptable," he said, his voice firm but controlled. "I've been flying Elite Airways for 15 years, and I've never seen such questioning of credentials." Jennifer's colleague, another flight attendant named Amy, appeared at the cabin door, drawn by the commotion. She took in the scene, the gathered crowd, the phone's recording, her coworker's rigid stance, and the composed elderly woman at the center of it all. Something in Dr. Washington's bearing made her pause, a flash of recognition crossing her face. "Jenny," Amy whispered urgently, tugging at her colleague's sleeve. "I think you should." But Jennifer cut her off with a sharp gesture. "We have procedures," she insisted, her voice taking on a defensive edge. "If this passenger can't provide adequate verification of her ticket purchase." "The ticket," Dr. Washington interjected softly, "was purchased through our executive travel office. The same office I established in 1995. She allowed a small smile to cross her face. "Though back then, we only had 3 planes and 7 employees. Things were much simpler." A ripple went through the watching crowd. Someone near the back whispered, "Oh my God, that's her." The young tech entrepreneur's eyes widened in recognition, and he quickly lowered his phone, though he didn't stop recording. Jennifer's face flushed deeper, but she had committed too fully to back down now. "Anyone could make such claims," she said, though her voice had lost its earlier certainty. "For security reasons, I'll need to call my supervisor." "That won't be necessary," came a new voice from the cabin doorway. "But I believe we're about to have a very interesting conversation about customer service and assumptions." The crowd parted as Captain Robert Miller stepped into the jet bridge. His face showed a mix of respect and concern as he recognized the airline's owner standing patiently in the boarding line. Jennifer turned toward his voice, and the color drained from her face as she realized the magnitude of her mistake. The ID she'd been scrutinizing so intensely suddenly felt very heavy in her hands. Yet even now, Dr. Washington's expression showed no triumph, no desire for revenge. Instead, her eyes held something that looked remarkably like compassion. She'd been in the business long enough to know that moments like these, painful as they were, often led to the most significant opportunities for growth, both personal and professional. Captain Robert Miller's appearance in the jet bridge changed everything in an instant. His crisp uniform and commanding presence drew all eyes, but it was his warm greeting that broke the tension like a thunderclap. "Dr. Washington." What an unexpected honor. He moved forward quickly, his face showing genuine pleasure at seeing her. Jennifer Chen stood frozen, her mind struggling to process what was happening. The ID cards she'd been holding so suspiciously suddenly felt like they were burning in her hands. She watched as the captain strode past her to shake Dr. Washington's hand warmly. "I had no idea you were flying with us today," Captain Miller continued, his voice carrying clearly to the gathered crowd. "Last time, I saw you was at the company's 30-year anniversary celebration. That speech you gave about building Elite Airways from scratch still gives me goosebumps thinking about it. The other passengers were watching intently now, many wearing knowing smiles. The young tech entrepreneur who'd been recording had lowered his phone slightly, but hadn't stopped the video. This was a moment worth remembering. "Robert," Dr. Washington said warmly, "it's wonderful to see you. How's Linda doing with her medical residency?" The personal touch in her question showed a leader who knew her employees as people, not just names on a payroll. The captain beamed. "She's thriving, thanks to that scholarship program you started. She talks about it all the time, how one conversation with you at the company picnic changed her whole career path." Jennifer felt her world tilting sideways. The elderly woman in simple clothes whom she tried to turn away, whom she'd accused of carrying fraudulent documents, was not only the owner of Elite Airways, but apparently someone who took a personal interest in her employees' families. The whispers among the waiting passengers grew louder. A businesswoman in a designer suit leaned over to her colleague and murmured, "That's Dr. Rose Washington. She started Elite Airways in her garage with one leased plane. Now it's worth billions." An older gentleman in the line nodded appreciatively. "I remember when she won Business Person of the Year back in 2010. Gave the whole acceptance speech about lifting others up as you climb." Amy, the other flight attendant, had moved to Jennifer's side, gently taking the ID cards from her now trembling hands. "Dr. Washington," she said respectfully, "would you like me to show you to your seat?" But Dr. Washington raised her hand slightly. "Just a moment," she said, her voice still carrying that same gentle tone she'd used throughout the entire confrontation. She turned to face Jennifer, who looked like she wanted to disappear into the jet bridge floor. "Young lady," Dr. Washington said, but there was no anger in her voice, no desire to humiliate. "I believe we have an opportunity here. Would you walk with me to my seat? I'd like to have a conversation of first impressions and second chances." Captain Miller watched this exchange with admiration. He'd been with Elite Airways for 20 years and had seen Dr. Washington handle difficult situations before. She had a way of turning confrontations into teaching moments, conflicts into opportunities for growth. The other passengers began to move aside, creating a path to the aircraft door. Some were still recording, but now their phones captured something unexpected. Not a moment of public shame, but a lesson in dignity and leadership. Jennifer, fighting back tears, managed to nod. Her perfectly maintained uniform felt like a costume now, her earlier confidence replaced by a deep understanding of how wrong she'd been. But something in Dr. Washington's expression gave her hope. This wasn't going to be the end of her career, but rather a beginning of something new. As they moved toward the aircraft door, Dr. Washington spoke quietly to Captain Miller. "Robert, I think we might need to schedule some additional company-wide training sessions." She glanced back at the passengers who were still watching. "And perhaps today's incident will help us create a more meaningful curriculum." The tension in the jet bridge had transformed into something else. A shared witnessing of how grace under pressure could turn a moment of prejudice into an opportunity for genuine change. As they disappeared into the aircraft, the remaining passengers exchanged glances, knowing they'd just seen something remarkable. A demonstration of true leadership that went far beyond titles and authority. The first-class cabin had fallen into a profound silence as Dr. Washington settled into her seat, 1A, with Jennifer standing nearby, her professional composure barely holding together. The other passengers found their seats quietly, many still processing what they had just witnessed in the jet bridge. The young tech entrepreneur who had recorded the incident slipped his phone into his pocket, but not before sending the video to cloud storage. Something told him this moment shouldn't be lost. "Would you like some water?" Jennifer asked, her voice barely above a whisper. Her hands trembled slightly as she reached for the bottle, remembering how just minutes ago she had been questioning this woman's right to be in first class. "That would be lovely," Dr. Washington replied, her voice carrying the same warmth it had maintained throughout the entire confrontation. "And please, sit with me for a moment." She patted the empty seat beside her, the one usually reserved for pre-flight crew preparations. The other flight attendant, Amy, quickly stepped in to handle the remaining passengers' needs, giving her colleague space for what was clearly going to be an important conversation. The businessman who had been recording earlier caught Amy's eye and mouthed, "Thank you." Somehow her simple act of kindness towards her distressed colleague had touched him. Jennifer sank into the seat, her legs feeling weak. "Dr. Washington, I'm so sorry. I don't know what to say. I've never been more embarrassed in my life." Her voice cracked slightly on the last words. "Embarrassment," Dr. Washington said thoughtfully, taking a small sip of water, "can be a powerful teacher, but only if we learn from it rather than let it crush us." She turned slightly in her seat to face Jennifer more directly. "Tell me, what made you so certain I didn't belong here?" The question hung in the air, not accusatory, but genuinely curious. A few nearby passengers pretended to be busy with their phones or magazines, but everyone was listening. This was turning into a masterclass in handling difficult situations. Jennifer looked down at her hands, folded tightly in her lap. I made assumptions, based on how you were dressed, your age." She stopped, the words sticking in her throat as she realized how terrible they sounded. "Keep going," Dr. Washington encouraged gently. "Sometimes we need to say our assumptions out loud to really hear how they sound." A mother and teenage daughter across the aisle exchanged glances. The daughter pulled out her notebook and began writing. Something about this moment felt important to record. "I thought," Jennifer continued, her voice stronger now, facing the truth of her actions, "that someone who could afford first class would look different, would dress differently. I didn't consider that someone might choose to dress simply, or that appearance has nothing to do with worth or success." Tears began forming in her eyes, but she blinked them back. Dr. Washington nodded, reaching into her worn leather bag. She pulled out a small photo album, the kind nobody carried anymore in this digital age. "Look at this," she said, opening to a specific page. "This was me in 1985 when I started this airline with one leased plane and a dream that everyone deserved to be treated with dignity while traveling." The photo showed a younger Dr. Washington, standing proudly in front of a single aircraft, wearing clothes not unlike what she had on today. Jennifer stared at the image, understanding dawning on her face. "I keep these clothes," Dr. Washington explained, smoothing her simple sweater, "to remind me of where I started and to see how my staff treats everyday people. Because in the end, that's what matters most, how we treat people when we think they can't do anything for us." From the cockpit doorway, Captain Miller watched the scene unfold, his pre-flight checklist temporarily forgotten. In his 20 years with the airline, he'd seen countless training sessions and professional development workshops, but nothing quite as powerful as this quiet conversation taking place in Seat 1A. Dr. Washington took another sip of water, then said something that would change the course of not just Jennifer's career, but the entire airline's approach to customer service. "Now, let's talk about how we can turn this moment into something that helps others learn and grow." 2 weeks after the incident, Jennifer sat nervously in Elite Airways' corporate training center. The room was filled with 30 other flight attendants and ground staff, all gathered for the first session of a new company-wide training program. The walls were lined with comfortable chairs arranged in a circle rather than the usual rows, creating an atmosphere of open dialogue. Dr. Washington stood in the center of the room, wearing the same simple sweater from that fateful day. "Before we begin," she said, addressing the group, "I want to make something clear. We're not here to shame anyone. We're here to learn and grow together." Her eyes met Jennifer's briefly, offering a reassuring smile. The young tech entrepreneur's video had indeed made its way online, but not in the way most viral confrontations did. Instead, Elite Airways had used it, with faces blurred and names changed, as a teaching tool. The airline had transformed a potential PR disaster into a moment of genuine change. I could have handled that situation differently. Jennifer spoke up, her voice stronger than she expected. I could have fired you on the spot, taken away your livelihood. But you chose to teach instead of punish. Why? Dr. Washington walked slowly around the circle, making eye contact with each person. Because punishment doesn't change hearts, she explained. It only creates fear, and fear never built anything worthwhile. She paused, letting her words sink in. Tell us, Jennifer, what have you learned these past 2 weeks? Jennifer stood, her uniform crisp, but her manner more relaxed than that day on the plane. I've learned that dignity isn't about what someone wears or how they look. I've learned that our assumptions can blind us to the humanity in others. She took a deep breath. But most importantly, I've learned that real strength isn't about showing power. It's about knowing when not to use it. A maintenance worker raised his hand. I've been thinking about this a lot since hearing about what happened. Yesterday, I caught myself making assumptions about a passenger who didn't speak English well. I stopped myself and remembered this story. It changed how I handled the whole situation. The room hummed with similar stories as others began sharing their own experiences with assumptions and bias. Dr. Washington listened intently to each one, occasionally jotting notes in her worn leather notebook, the same one she'd carried since starting the airline. Here's what we're going to do, Dr. Washington announced, standing in the center again. We're creating a new training module called Dignity in Flight. Jennifer will help lead it. She turned to face the surprised flight attendant. Your experience, painful as it was, can help others avoid the same mistakes. Jennifer felt tears welling up again, but this time they were different. You want me to help lead the training, after what I did. Especially after what you did, Dr. Washington replied. Because you understand now. You've lived it. And that makes you the perfect person to help others understand too. The training session continued for hours, with role-playing exercises and open discussions. People shared stories of times they'd been judged, times they judged others, and moments when they wished they'd done things differently. The atmosphere transformed from nervous tension to genuine engagement. A young ground crew member raised his hand. I always thought these sensitivity trainings were just for show, you know. But this feels different. It feels real. Dr. Washington nodded. That's because it is real. We're not just checking boxes here. We're changing how we see each other, how we treat each other. She gestured to the room. Look around. Every person here has a story. Every person here deserves dignity. And every person here has the power to make someone else's day better or worse. As the session wound down, Jennifer stayed behind to help stack chairs. Dr. Washington approached her with a small package. Open it, she encouraged. Inside was a new name badge with an additional title. Dignity and Inclusion Trainer. Are you sure about this? Jennifer asked, running her finger over the engraved words. More sure than I've ever been, Dr. Washington replied. Sometimes our biggest mistakes lead to our most important purpose. You're ready for this new role, not despite what happened, but because of how you've grown from it. 3 years had passed since that life-changing day on Flight 207. The Elite Airways Training Center buzzed with energy as Jennifer stood at the podium, addressing a room full of new employees. The worn leather chair in the front row was occupied by Dr. Washington, who made it a point to attend these sessions whenever her schedule allowed. When I started this job, Jennifer began, her confidence now matching her expertise. I thought I knew everything about good customer service. I had the highest ratings, the best feedback scores. But I didn't understand what really mattered until the day I made the biggest mistake of my career. She paused, looking around the room. A mistake that turned into my greatest blessing. The screen behind her showed carefully edited footage from that day, used with permission and faces blurred. The new employees watched intently as the scene unfolded. In the front row, Dr. Washington nodded encouragingly, wearing another one of her signature simple sweaters. You see that woman in the video? Jennifer continued, gesturing to the screen. The one I tried to turn away from first class? She had every right to fire me. Instead, she showed me what true leadership looks like. She taught me that real service isn't about enforcing rules, it's about honoring human dignity. A young trainee raised her hand. But how do you balance security concerns with treating everyone with respect? Excellent question, Jennifer smiled. Let me show you some techniques we've developed. She demonstrated the new customer service protocols that had been implemented across the airline. Methods that maintain security while preserving dignity. The training had become so successful that other airlines had started sending their staff to learn from Elite Airways. Dr. Washington stood up slowly, joining Jennifer at the front. What Jennifer won't tell you, she said warmly, is that these protocols she's teaching you, she helped design them. She took her experience and transformed it into something that's changing our entire industry. The room broke into spontaneous applause. Jennifer felt tears forming, but didn't try to hide them. These weren't tears of shame anymore. They were tears of pride and gratitude. But the real success stories, Jennifer continued, are the ones we hear from our passengers. She clicked to the next slide, showing customer feedback quotes. Last month, an elderly gentleman wrote to thank us for how we handled his confusion during boarding. A mother praised our staff for helping her child who was flying alone. A businessman commented that he'd never felt so respected on any other airline. Dr. Washington stepped forward again. 3 years ago, we could have handled things very differently. We could have fired Jennifer, released a corporate apology, and moved on. Instead, we chose to learn and grow. And look what happened. Our customer satisfaction scores are at an all-time high. Our staff turnover is at an all-time low. And most importantly, we're creating a culture of genuine respect. After the session, as the new trainees filed out, many stopped to thank Jennifer and Dr. Washington. The last to leave was a young flight attendant who lingered behind. Something on your mind? Jennifer asked kindly. I made a similar mistake last week, the young woman admitted quietly. I judged someone based on how they looked. I've been feeling terrible about it. Jennifer exchanged glances with Dr. Washington before responding. Then you're in exactly the right place. Because what matters isn't the mistake. It's what you learn from it, and how you use that learning to help others. As they gathered their materials, Dr. Washington touched Jennifer's shoulder gently. You know, when I started this airline, I dreamed of creating something different. Not just another company, but a place where every person's dignity mattered. Thanks to people like you, that dream is becoming real. Outside the training center windows, an Elite Airways plane took off into the sunset. Inside, 2 women from very different backgrounds shared a moment of understanding. A testament to how one difficult moment, handled with grace and wisdom, could transform not just 2 lives, but an entire company's culture.